Welcome everybody to the next part of our Scrappy Socks tutorial. Now at the end of the last one you were working down the leg and you should now be at the point where you're ready to knit your heel flap. Now as you can see, I've already knit my heel flap and turn. All I did was I just cut the last yarn that I was using. In my case it was this yellow, and then I started knitting the heel flap with my new yarn. So you're just carrying on as you've been doing all the way down the leg. So I've finished my heel flap and heel turn, and then I've cut my yarn, as you can see. So at the moment I've got no yarns attached. Now I'll just quickly say before we carry on, I've been asked how many grams of yarn I use per stripe. Now this really does depend on your stitch count, it depends on your gauge, and of course it depends on how many rows, how many rounds you're working per stripe. But I use about 2 grams for each of those 10 rows. Now that obviously will be different for your heel flap and turn. You're going to use a bit more, and also the rounds where you're working your gusset decreases, you've got a few more stitches, so you're going to use slightly more yarn in those areas, but generally it's about 2 grams that I use. So now what we're going to do is pick up our stitches. I'm going to show you how I close the gaps that you can get in those corners, and then I'm also going to show you in this tutorial how I get rid of, if I bring in this sock here, but can you see this stitch here is looser than all the other stitches around it, and this always bugged me. It's the last stitch on the instep before you start picking up the stitches on the sort of second side. So now I do a little thing and it tightens up that stitch, so I'm also going to show you that. Let's start by picking up our stitches. So I've got my new yarn. In my case I'm picking up 16 stitches in the actual heel flap edge, but then I'm also going to pick up some stitches to close the gap. So first of all, let's just pick up the 16 stitches as we normally would do. So the first one I pick up is right there. So I'll quickly whiz along here. We just loop this over as we've been doing when we changed yarns previously, and just work your way up those slip stitches. Nothing different to how you would normally pick up for your heel flap. I'm just going to make sure I don't knit with my tail. I'll just work my way up. So that one is 16, and the last one is always in the colour that you worked last on the leg, because that stitch, if you remember, when you start your heel flap you slip that first stitch, and it's, in my case it's in the yellow, so it's always in that different colour. So that's the 16 that we've picked up, and you can just tighten up. We'll weave in those obviously and tighten those up at the end. I pick up 2 stitches, not 1. Now I think a lot of people just pick up 1 in the gap. I've found that by picking up 2 it gives a much neater finish, and decreasing that extra stitch away, you know, is never a problem. So the first stitch I'm going to pick up, all I'm going to do is I'm going to carry on following that line of where I've been picking up the slip stitches, and I'm just going to pick up that stitch right there. So it just really looks like the slip stitches you've been picking up, except it wasn't slipped. So I'm just going to go underneath both legs, hold your yarn nice and tight, and pick that stitch up. So if you carry on working down from where you've just picked up to the next stitch, it would be there. But what I'm going to do is go across half a stitch to here, and I'm picking up right there. So we go down a stitch and then across half a stitch, and I'm going to put my needle in right there. And there we go, that's our extra 2 stitches. So now I pop on a stitch marker, turn my work around, just tighten up around there. That's it. Okay, push the instep stitches back on, and now I'm going to knit across to the halfway point of my instep stitches. So in my case that's 16 stitches. So I'm just going to knit across there. That's 16. Now what I'm going to do is I push all of these stitches I've just worked onto the other needle, so we basically just pull like that, and they are now part of that side of the heel flap. So I'll work across the other half of my instep, and then we'll pick up stitches going down the other side. And it's this stitch here, the one that's on my needle now, is the one that becomes loose, and I think it's because there's a round here that hasn't been completed in effect, and you know, it's going no further, and so there isn't a stitch after it to tighten it up, and I think that's why it becomes loose, but we'll sort it out. So now I'll pop my marker on. So we're going in the opposite direction, so I'm picking up those 2 extra stitches first, so but we're doing it in the other direction. So the first thing I need to do is pick up, not in this one, if you can see, this one is the last slip stitch, so that in effect is stitch 16, and then this one is the first extra stitch, so we work backwards from that, we go down 1 and across half a stitch, and that's where we're going to pick up that first stitch, and again work nice and tight. And then the second extra stitch is as before, it's not a slip stitch, but it kind of looks like a slip stitch, and that's the second extra one. And now we can just go down and pick up the 16 stitches, in my case, as normal. So that's my 16 stitches. So now what I'm going to do is flip the work over and then pull my needle through and pop all of the stitches on that side back on. It'll feel quite tight because where we picked up those stitches, I always tend to pick them up nice and tight, so just push them on, they will go on. And now we need to knit across half of the heel flap stitches. In my case, my heel flap ended with 12 stitches, so I just knit across 6. And then that point is the new start of your round. It's in the centre of your heel flap. 4, 5, 6. And push those onto the back. So now we've completely flipped our work, if you like. Previously this was the start of the round, and now it's in the middle of the heel flap. So we're all set up now to start working our gusset decreases. So what I always do is on the first round, this is really important for getting a really neat finish in your corners. The first round, after you've picked up all your gusset stitches, you're just going to do a plain knit round, no decreases. The only extra thing I do, and this again is optional, but the 16 stitches that I picked up along the side of the heel flap, I always knit those through the back loop. Just the 16, not the 2 extras, knit those normally. So I will do that plain knit round, and then I'll be back in a second where we're going to be at the start of the first decrease round, where I can show you how we sort out that loose stitch. Okay, so I've done that plain knit round, and then I'm now halfway through the first decrease round. So I've worked the first side, doing my first decrease just as we normally do before the marker here. And the reason that I knit the stitches through the back loop that I picked up along the heel flap is because it tightens all those stitches up. You can see the stitches along the first line here are all twisted. That just tightens them and makes that as neat as I think I can get it. So that's the reason we do that. So I'm now on the second side, and this is the side that I've talked about with the loose stitch, and you can see the loose stitch. If you look down at the work here, you can see it right here. Can you see how this stitch, it's the one that's sort of one stitch below the one that's on your needle. It's looser than all the rest, so we're going to sort that out. So I'm just going to knit across to the stitch marker. So you can see it right here, you can see that loose stitch, the little devil here. So what we're going to do is we're going to look on the back of our work, we're going to reach down with our right hand needle and we're going to grab the yarn that's attached to that stitch, And you can tell it's that one because it's not the one that's directly on your needle, it's the one below. And in my case, I know that it's a different colour because we're working scrappy socks, which is quite handy. So I know it's this here. And what I'm going to do when I've grabbed hold of it is I'm going to pop it up on my left-hand needle. And can you see how straight away now we've completely tightened up that stitch? And all we're doing is we are tensioning that looseness on the back. So I'm now just going to knit those two together. So the loop from the back of the loose stitch and that last stitch before the marker, I've knit them together. And it just tightens up that stitch. You'll be able to see it better once you've worked a couple of rows above it. So I'm just going to work my decrease on the other side. I always now, I have spoke about this on the podcast, but instead of doing SSKs, I never do SSKs anymore. I do slip one, knit one, pass slip stitch over. And that's just a personal preference. I think it's easier to work, and I also think it looks slightly neater on a gusset. So if you haven't tried replacing your SSK with a slip one, knit one, pass slip stitch, so if you haven't tried replacing your SSK with the slip one, knit one, pass slip stitch over, then give it a go and see what you think. I just find it much less fussy to work. So I'll just finish this side now, and then I can show you that area that we've tightened up a bit easier. If you now look below this stitch here, it's tightened it right up. You can really see it better when you've worked another row after this row, and you'll be able to see that area looks much tighter and neater than it did previously. So you can now carry on and finish your gusset decreases. Just what you need to watch out for is don't forget that we are using scraps, and you've got to maintain those stripes. I sometimes forget when I'm doing the gusset decreases and I go past the 10 rounds I'm supposed to be working. But just keep an eye on it, and remember that we're changing yarns at this point here. Although this is our current start of round, this is where we've actually been changing yarns for this, the scrappy stripes. So as soon as you've got those 10 rows here, use your sort of instep is what you're looking at. As soon as you've knit the right number there, when you get to this point, just cut that yarn, start knitting with a new one, and carry on your gusset decreases. So I will see you in the next tutorial when we will have finished the gusset decreases and we're ready just to swap around the orientation of the sock and complete our foot. So I will see you back then.